Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How Open Source Helps Bring Back Product Obsession. Before we get started today, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping notes so you know how to participate in today's event. First, when you joined this webinar, your audio may have connected via your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, you can just select phone call in the audio pane, and the dial-in information will be displayed there for you. Also, if you have any questions for our presenters, please do submit those via the questions pane of the control panel. You can send in your questions at any time during this presentation. We will answer as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end of today's event. Finally, I'd also like to remind everyone that today's presentation is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to view both the recording and the slides following this event. It is now my pleasure to introduce two of my amazing Sauce Labs colleagues, Christian Broman and Diego Molina. Christian and Diego lead the Sauce Labs Open Source Program Office and are active members of the open source community. In addition to their work as software engineers at Sauce Labs, Diego is a Selenium core committer, and Christian is a WebDriver IO core contributor. Without further ado, I'll turn this over to the experts. Christian and Diego, take it away.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you for the kind words. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our presentation about how open source can bring back product obsession to you and your organizations. So let's get started.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christian. As Susie mentioned, I'm working as a senior software engineer at Sauce Labs. I would call myself an open source and open standards advocate because I believe in open source software and open standards. I'm representing the company as an IC representative at the W3C. I'm a cross-project council member at the OpenJS Foundation, and as Susie mentioned, the WebDriver project lead.
Right, and as Susie also mentioned about me, I am an open source contributor, mostly to the Selenium project. A big enthusiast about the Selenium project as well, and I am part of the technical committee that decides the roadmap in technical terms for the Selenium project. One shameless plug here is that we are 2 members in the team. We are looking for a 3rd one. So if you're interested, simply just go to opensource.saucelabs.com and check the link at the bottom, or you can email us for more information. So let's move to the agenda. What we want to tell you today is, in short, we want to tell you the story of how we got started in open source at Sauce Labs from the beginning, how we have been contributing to open source from day one, how we are adopting the concept of open source in the organization we have today, and to round up, we want to share some achievements we have gotten in the last 3-4 months since we started this team.
Awesome. I want to start with telling you a little story about how I joined Sauce Labs. This happened almost exactly a month ago, almost exactly 6 years and 1 month ago. This was the actual photo from that day, me bringing my candy cone with the laptop and all the pencils to it, to the company for my first day. And I was really excited about that because Sauce was not a normal company to me as a student of computer science in Berlin. I not only got the chance to travel to the United States for the first time in my life, Sauce Labs as a company was special because I was a fan of a lot of people that have been working in the company. These people have been engaged in a lot of engineering communities around the world and have been talking about Sauce Labs and the company's vision. I was a fan of Jonathan Lips, who co-created Appium right after he gave his talk at AlexJS in 2012, where he was playing live on stage with a guitar, supported by 4 Android devices and 1 iOS device running on Appium. And he was playing a song that he has self-composed there. Still, until today, my favorite talk of all times. I was a fan of Adam Christian, who I met at the local JS meetup, JavaScript meetup here in Berlin. He created the first WebDriver binding in the JavaScript ecosystem, and he's still a good friend of mine to today. I also was a fan of Jason Huggins, who not only created Selenium, but also was the founder, also created Selenium and founded Sauce Labs. And Sebastian, both who have spoken at conferences that I've been to and that I've followed. Once I joined the company, I got to know Santi and Jonah and a bunch of other folks who were also involved in the communities, speaking on conferences, and were true thought leaders in that new kind of test automation space. I was excited because I joined a company that built really cool things that popular open source projects that I particularly used put on their resume, put on their README file. We still have those kind of quality badges for open source projects, and a lot of them still use them. And it's exciting that I joined a company that built these quality, benchmarks for these open source tools. I was also excited because I joined a company where everyone in engineering was part of the open source ecosystem. A lot of engineers have contributed to community projects that are not even owned by Sauce Labs. In this example, the Source Connect launcher that is still used today by a lot of people who received contribution from Jonathan and Jonah, who I mentioned before, and someone called Seb Free, who still works at the company. It was clear that from the beginning that our platform can only be accessible when we build and support the tools that use our platform. Another fascinating thing was that the company has celebrated their successes with the community. As you can see in this video of the official Appium launch, we knew that Appium as a project has been not only co-created here at Sauce, we have been driven the development of the project since the beginning. And it was a community project from the begin with. Even though at some point it was called Appium by Sauce, we soon realized that in order to make Appium a successful project, we need to develop it on a neutral ground, which is why we sponsored it to the JS Foundation to provide this neutral ground to help Appium grow, not only technically, but also from the community aspect. Now, today, with Sauce having grown to 300 to a 300 employee company, and with providing a platform with tons of features to tons of customers, the engineering organization in particular has changed a lot. What has been a single engineering team working on specific features is now a dispersed, diverse group of people with different responsibilities, including engineering, scrum masters, product management, sales engineering, product marketing, and many more. Jumping to 2019, last year, we see that product announcements has been or are done quite differently nowadays. The startup excitement kind of has deflagrated a bit, and everything has become more mature. For example, with this virtual USB release, which we posted as a small blog post with a link to a wiki page where customer can find out how to use the product. The responsibility of envisioning the virtual USB feature as well as writing this blog post was part of product, while the wiki page and all the documentation around has been done by a technical writing team. And there's nothing wrong with this type of announcement, but you see that by now the developer nor the customer has been much involved in that. It demonstrates an interesting challenge that every company faces when they grow. It's about the cultural development within the company as it's going to try to stay product focused and product obsessed. Today, it's almost inevitable that if you grow as a company, your culture changes as well. And you try to become more profitable while at the same time scale an organization of engineers, product people, marketing people, and so on. People come and leave the company, and often the ones that passionately have built the company vision from the beginning and now moving to the different challenges, leaving it up to the folks that now follow that vision with not that passion anymore. And there's not really anyone to blame. This is just a normal way how every company develops over time. The fact that we need to do is to acknowledge those changes and either manifest the good ones by embedding them into our company values, or see the ones that are bad more critically and address them on an organizational level. As engineers, we should always ask critical about what kind of engineering organization we want to be when we grow as a company. And there are really kind of like two types these days in the industry. A type A company where a product team is solely responsible for the product vision, where marketing people show engineering work on conferences and events, where sales engineers do all the communication with the outside world, and engineers are only put on customer calls if necessary. There are also type B companies where the engineering organization is an active contributor to the product roadmap and the vision behind it, where engineers show off their own strong engineering skills on conferences or on blog posts, and where they are actively part of the customer journey and engage with the ecosystem and the communities behind that. If you want to be a real thought leader, you need to understand your field as best as possible to also understand how you can help your customer as best as possible. And there are a lot of signs that can tell you whether or not your organization is obsessed with your product and connected with your product. Some of these red flags can be, is your own company even using the product that you build and you sell to customers? Does your own company use the product themselves extensively? Are they interested in how customers use the features that you provide them? And is your engineering organization too focused on their own problems or the ones that the ones that your customers have? It's important that we as an engineering organization don't just throw boxes over an imaginary wall where we have customers figuring out the features by themselves. We need to be actively part of their journey and understand their need and be actually the champion to solve their problems. So how can we become such an product obsessed organization and culture? I believe something that can help is open source. Everyone knows this famous quote by Mark Andreessen from 2011 saying, "Software is eating the world." Now, almost a decade later, we know that software actually has eaten the world, but we also know that open source has eaten software. Open source has become an ubiquitous instrument for not only innovation, but also to build and increase a product-obsessed culture from within. And while most successful tech companies these days, for example, Google, IBM, already have an open source program office, I say that such an office will become a mandatory branch in every tech company within the next years. Such an office can help the company's various ways, not only to manifest product obsession from within, but also it can facilitate innovation and drive strategic and second order benefits. So let's have a look in how SaaS has retained their product obsession through open source.
Right, so I think up to this point, you have understood basically how we can tackle this challenge. And I think it's pretty clear for us that open source can help, but we need to figure out how can open source help. To start, we were sitting down and analyzing the situation, and from our open source experience, we were just went one slide back, sorry. We were trying to understand how this could actually makes sense for our organization. So we were considering two options, which was one was the open source team, or the other one was the open source program office. We have experience at Sauce Labs already with an open source team, and we saw that if the idea is to make presence in the open source ecosystem, you can achieve fast results if you just form a group of people that can start contributing to open source. And this team can be the proxy, communication proxy between product and open source, driving ideas back and forth. But this could end up as a bottleneck, of course. Something else that could happen is that this work could end up as an isolated way, depending on the communication between the internal part of the company and the open source team. And finally, the expertise will rely in just one team. Therefore, we explored a bit deeper the challenge, the approach of having an open source program office. And we understood quickly that we could have results not immediately, but they could have a bigger impact in the middle and long term, because we would enable communication between each team and the product and open source by teaching and enabling people to do that by themselves. With that, the work becomes more collaborative between teams inside Sauce Labs and between the teams and the community. And one side benefit is that the expertise of doing open source is spread across the organization. So I guess that many of you out there haven't heard of the term OSPO, the Open Source Program Office. And as Christian mentioned, many big companies have a program like this, because the idea of this type of organization is to regulate and manage the relationship between you as an organization and the open source ecosystem. And the main point of this type of teams that drive the program office is to understand where we should put our efforts, right? We should understand what is happening in the open source ecosystem, what project is maybe more important than another one, and therefore we can understand easily where we should put our efforts. Having said that, it's not only about contributing to open source, but also understanding what is happening in the open source ecosystem. And that information can be fed back right away into the product to make your organization more successful. At Sauce Labs, we want to do this because, as we mentioned from the beginning, DNA is present in Sauce Labs from the beginning. We were pushing for Selenium, for Appium, and so on. So the main reason for this is that users that interact with the Sauce Labs platform, they use open source tools. And if any of those tools is in a bad shape, the users will suffer and the whole experience will go left. Also, we want to enable all employees to be able to consume and contribute to open source in a simple and safe way. But in addition to that, we want to improve the communication between the open source ecosystem and the product. So therefore, ideas and new features for projects and products can flow in both directions. And in the end, by putting the developers and the product closer to the community, there will be more engagement into the product itself to making it much better, more appealing for the end user. So having said that, what do we want to do in Sauce Labs relating to open source? And perhaps these ideas can also help your organization to increase the product obsession. First of all, we want to increase how stable and how industry-wide adopted are the open source projects we promote to the different users of our platform. So we want to make automation projects that are useful for our platform and for our users, stable and awesome. In addition to that, we want to contribute and shape the industry standards that are part of our long-term vision. For example, WebDriver is nowadays a W3C recommendation standard, and therefore we want to be part of this process. And any other technology or standard that comes along with it that helps our users, we want to be part of that. And as a side effect, we want to build a reputation for the engineering done in Sauce Labs as a home for solid open source, that people think of Sauce Labs as a place that is friendly for open source, that innovation happens through this interaction. And for your organizations, this could also be a good appealing for recruiting as a consequence. In the end, we want to make the way for more doors to open and stop focusing on WebDriver only and make the door wider and more inclusive for different types of technology that help our end users be successful in the automation world.
So the question remains, what should open source cover? What can an open source program office can do? And the answer is not that easy. The question is not that easy to answer. Every company is different, and every company has a different, creates a different product. Every company as well had also different cultural challenges and different organizational structures. There's no open source program office like the other, even within single industries. Every office needs to have their own priorities depending on the company. For example, not every open source program office needs to be within engineering. There are open source program offices that can very well fit within legal departments, within marketing departments, or within an advocacy team. That can make creating such an office really challenging, but there are great resources on the internet that show other companies how they created successful open source program offices that are suited to their priorities. These resources can be found on the To-Do Rope website or directly on the website of the Linux Foundation. As a whole, and looking at various of sources, I like to have this model as like the 5+1 pillars of open source responsibility. From consumption of open source from the bottom to distributing open source within your company and outside the company from the top. Starting from the bottom, I think the first point that particularly technical open source program office needs to cover is the oversight of open source consumptions within engineering. Today, 60 to 80% of software products already use a big chunk of open source, but there's always a lot of opportunity how you can deliver faster, less expensive, and with much more flexibility if you replace proprietary code segments with open source products, or use tooling that are open source as well. Further up the chain, we look at compliance that is often ignored in a lot of companies, but it's very important to prevent loss of IP or punitive damages. An open source program office here needs to maintain compliance reviews and has an oversight of all the usages of open source dependencies. And if this can't be done manually, there needs to be some tooling around it. Here, the open source program office should act less as a gateway and more as a facilitator to serve the different individual engineering teams in your organization. So for instance, if someone wants to pull the dependencies into the project, they should not need to go to the open source program office and ask for permission. There should be a clear set of rules that show the engineers what kind of licenses can be used within what kind of product. As we go further up the chain from consuming to distributing, the next important step is inner sourcing, which can help to bring the benefits of open source software development into the teams in your organization. I believe a lot of you already have been part of a team that had to take on a project that had either no or barely any documentation, where the infrastructure of that product or project was broken, or where some parts of the project weren't even accessible to everyone. Inner sourcing can help here to establish an open source culture within engineering organizations internally for internal source code. The next challenge is, of course, also contributing to open source. And here, it's not only contributing from within the organization, but also have other people contribute to your project. There needs to be a clear set of rules that not only explain your engineers how they can contribute, but also explain the engineers from other companies how they can contribute to your open source project. Here, you might want to consider license agreements for your projects that have been open source, and you might want to consider policies how your engineers are supposed to contribute to open source projects, and provide contribution guidelines for external people wanting to contribute to your project. Lastly, there's a competitive part within the open source program office that can help the company to play a strategic role in the ecosystem by either complement to an open source project or compete against it. Last but not least, the community aspect of open source in the open source program office is an essential component and part of every layer throughout the stack. From consuming open source software, where you need to engage with the community to steer a project into the right direction, towards contributing and distributing your own open source projects and build a community around it. So now there can be different focus points depending on your product needs and requirements. For us, as mentioned in the introduction, we want to, as Source Labs grows as a company, we want to retain the product obsession within engineering. And we think we can do this by open source. Looking at the former model, that I think, yeah, there used to be emojis there, but they don't show up today. Anyway, from the former model where we have the solutions architect or sales engineers, as well as customer support and marketing, having a directly influence on the customers, through support tickets, through advertisement, or through direct support, who then, influence the product owner in their product vision and in prioritizing product roadmaps, where at the end of the chain, there's the engineer who only connects really with the product backlog. And this can be problematic because with that model, engineering is completely decoupled from the customer and his experience with the product. Also, technical problems lose some sort of context when they're being narrated through multiple channels. And overall, engineering can lose the big picture of how a single product within a single team influences other products from other engineering teams. The model that we want to move towards is bringing the engineer towards the customer, to the front line of our customer engagement, and have them interact through open source. With this, engineering becomes much more engaged with the customer and the community around it. They will be able to understand a lot of technical problems much earlier, and therefore help the product owner to not only visioning the product moving on, but also to prioritize the backlog and understand what's more important right now at one certain product stage throughout the life cycle. And the most important part is engineering becomes exposed to customer feedback in the positive as well as negative way, helps them to understand how they can actually improve the product furthermore to please the customer better throughout the time. So with that, we're convinced that by establishing the open source program office, we can not only drive innovation, but also product obsession within our engineering organization. And open source is a big part of that. While we have just started, we already identified a couple of initiatives that we are currently already actively pushing in the company.
Exactly. And now the challenge comes more to the point where we have all these things we want to do, and we have to figure out a way on how to enable a complete organization to work on open source. So for that, we started short. So first, we targeted the people who are more prone to get involved with open source, who are the people in the engineering teams. For example, we set up a set of guidelines that could help employees to do open source, and we divided them in two. The first one, which is the most, we could call it trivial one, which could be when you find issues in an open source project, like reporting issues, contributing documentation, joining a project to help in the project maintenance, such as doing grooming or creating roadmaps. These type of non-code contributions are usually more straightforward in the part of when we want to enable people to do open source, and any employee can do that freely as part of their work or not. But when we are going to talk about code contributions, generally we divide them in two. One could be the contribution that is triggered by a work task, which means that you are working on your normal daily work, and you have a dependency, which is an open source project. And to actually fulfill the objective of your task at work, you need to add a feature to this open source project, or you need to fix a bug. And therefore, there is the opportunity to contribute to open source. These type of contributions are part of your normal work, but the other type of contributions are personal initiatives that a person might have to do in their own free time, or they can make them fit to be part of their regular work hours. But in the end, they are contributions based on personal initiatives. And what we need to have always in mind, at least that's what we put for all Sauce Labs employees, and this could be useful for your organization as well, is that we have compiled a set of licenses that make sense to contribute. So when someone contributes to an open source project, it's very important the type of license, because we want to make sure that the contribution made to this project is going to be kept open source and free to be used by anyone and reused by many people across the ecosystem. But in addition, I think it makes sense for any type of organization that we should not share confidential information about our companies when we contribute to open source. So this is like a guideline that maybe it's common sense for some people, but it doesn't hurt to make it more clear that contributions to open source should not share confidential information of your company. And there are also a set of approved contribution license agreements that it's healthy to have a list of them, so people who want to contribute as part of their work, they don't need to keep signing new contribution license agreements. In general, to have an overview of how can a project be open sourced, let's imagine that an engineering team has a project used internally, and they see potential of offering this to the open source ecosystem. So how could this look? I think the overall process could encapsulate on 4 simple steps that could have a little detail, but in general, these should be the steps. The first one should be that we need to get approval, and the approval comes from your peers and from your manager. Why do we say that? Because open source is not only pushing code to GitHub in the open. Open source is also about maintaining a community. It's about writing good documentation. It's about answering GitHub issues to people who want to understand how to use your project. So this takes time. And if you want to make your project successful, you should also promote it. So maybe talk in a conference, maybe tweet about it. All these things take time. And that's why it's a good idea to involve your manager and your team So they all understand that some of your work time will be spent into open source. But also, it's key to use best practices, because the key of using best practices will end up as a great user experience for anyone who wants to onboard into your project. So the idea would be to have a nice README, a nice set of instructions that helps anyone to get started into your project. For example, you can see that there is a clear contribution guideline. If someone wants to send you a pull request and add a feature to your project, what steps should they follow? If someone finds a security issue with a dependency or with your project, how can they report that? Like, there are a few things that are considered as best practices in open source, so we should follow all of them. And if anyone is wondering how to get into that, how to get all those details, all this information is, you could find it at opensource.saucelabs.com. Moving on, a third step would be to prepare the repository. You need to check that the repository has good comments, that, for example, no passwords or no tokens are committed into the code. The commit history is clean. But super important is that if someone wants to use or contribute to your project, that it's easy to run it anywhere. In our case, that anyone can run a project we open source at Sauce Labs without needing to be in the Sauce Labs environment. And in the end, people need some sort of review before actually pushing things to GitHub or to the open. So in Sauce Labs, and you can do this in your organization, there could be a group of interested engineers who can review your project, also with the help of the open source program office. But one thing is really important when you enable people to start doing open source. When we open the gateway for innovation and creativity through open source, we also need to check every now and then how things are going on. So as recommended, we should have a set of policy gateways, because these policies about having like a nice README, a contribution guide, a security document, checking that no tokens, no passwords are committed into the files, we should check them, and hopefully in an automatic way. So in general, we should check this type of things, that the projects we serve and we open source to the community, they have a proper license, so people can actually use open source software without the fear of falling into any loophole. And all our projects should follow these quality standards that I have mentioned in the previous slides. In addition to that, it's not enough to just enable people to do open source and to check that they're complying, but it's super important to measure how you're doing over time. Because as we say there, if you don't measure how you're doing, you cannot improve and get better over time. So we are getting into the analysis of understanding what metrics make sense for our projects in open source. There is an organization called the CHAOS organization, which is, I think, a subset of the Linux Foundation. And they spend a good amount of time defining different types of metrics that are useful for open source projects. So it's not only about how many GitHub issues are created, how many pull requests, how many contributors, but it's also about diversity and inclusion, the risk and the value, and so on. One important thing that we're working on is the ambassador program. So it's not enough to tell people, okay, here are the guidelines, this is how you can do open source now, but it's very important actually to reach to the teams and understand all their needs and ideas between them. As one of the main targets here is that when you have this interaction like one-to-one or one to the team or team to team, it's much easier to understand how people can engage and benefit and contribute from open source. So if you spend time to meet regularly to support with each team or each member of the team who is interested in open source, it's much easier to actually get something out of the work that happens in these teams. And by having a different set of eyes on this open source work, we can identify new opportunities. We can also get feedback about the work you're doing out there, about policies and guidelines. And in the end, we can motivate people to follow these policies and help us to make our open source SOSLabs GitHub organization look in a better shape. In the end, if all this works well, these people who are members of the different engineering teams and join us into this open source journey, they will become an extended member of the open source program office, because right now we are 2 people. We hope to be 3 soon. But in the end, it's a large number of engineering teams that they need to get the idea and the enablement to do open source on their own. So if you spread this open source spirit, they will become 1 member more of your team. So some of the things we have been working on the last few months is to actually find a way to connect developers and bring them closer to the community. One of them achievements that we have gotten already in these last 3-4 months that we have been working on this open source program office is the Test Runner Toolkit project. I won't go into a lot of detail, but it's a project that enables you to run Puppeteer, Playwright, Cypress, and Tascafé tests in our cloud through Docker containers. Most of the ideas, the interactions, the feedback that we have gotten for that team have happened through GitHub issues. And this is the point that Christian was mentioning around the beginning of the talk, that how you can bring engineers and people who actually write the code closer to the community to understand and find out how their code is being used. And it's important to highlight here that when you actually see the feedback right away for the work you are doing from the end user, this product obsession starts to get bigger and bigger, because you see how the code you have writing and releasing is getting used. But aside from that, there is an opportunity here when teams interact with the community, because there is a way to simplify how software is delivered. Let me give you a few examples of that. One is, imagine that your team delivers to your customer or to your end user a binary or an executable file. So there are different ways to deliver this. One could be a Docker image. You could also put this into a GitHub action or a Circle CI orb. Also, many times people use your executables, your deliverables in different CI servers like Travis Jenkins or different other ones. And if you provide examples on how this software can be used, the engagement to your project and to your open source project will be much bigger, and people will be more enthusiastic about getting into it. But also, not everyone delivers a binary, right? Some teams just deliver facing API. So you can also deliver something like an open API spec, where people can develop client bindings for them, or why not, if the team has the resources and the time, the team can also deliver client bindings for the API. In our case, many of the SOSLab resources, like starting a test, stopping a test, adding a name to the test, all these methods are available to our API, and we have a few client bindings for them that you can use to simplify and make the execution of your test in our cloud much more simple. So you can follow this example in your organization as well. And of course, we need to have clear documentation telling people how they could interact with these APIs. Aside from the work that we have just mentioned to you, where we're enabling an entire organization, as maybe some of you remember, one of our objectives is to increase the tools that we recommend to our users to increase how awesome they are, how stable they are, and target the industry to adopt them widely. Therefore, that's why we have also put a lot of effort into making our core projects healthier and in a better shape. So, for example, we have contributed the governance model for the Selenium project, which makes transparent how people can join the project. We are actively contributing to the Selenium 4 and the Appium 2 release, and we are also improving constantly the WebDriver IO project and its community. We're making it bigger because our side goal or our side wish, hope is that while enabling an entire organization to do open source, they will end up in a position where they're able to engage with these projects as well. So instead of having only 2 or 3 people contributing to these projects, our target in the medium and long term is that we could have a big set of people from different engineering teams contributing to this project as well. Because what we want to have is the habit of contributing to open source, make it as a healthy habit that you could do on a weekly basis or similar frequency. One thing that we are working actively with different people in the engineering organization is to grow our developer blog. In general, our target audience is the community, developers, engineers, anyone who's interested to understand how we're tackling the challenges we have in our platform and in our open source projects. And one thing that is important here, because we have been talking a lot about open source and how to enable people in engineering and in the organization, something that it's important to highlight here is that sometimes people don't have time to do open source work, or maybe some people don't really like to do open source work, but they still do technical work or they tackle interesting challenges. So one of the things that we're trying to do through this platform, through the developer blog, is just a starting point where we can actually allow everyone to be part of this movement. So the idea is that everyone gets recognized for their work, their technical work in some way, but it's really important that not everyone is like a really good technical writer. Like many of us, we are not native English speakers. So a way to do this is like to help them, sit with them, help them create draft blog posts and collaborate with people who are in the organization, like our marketing team, who is great in writing really nice blog posts, so we can connect different parts of the organization to do that. So this is something you could also do in your organization. If you want to learn more about our adventures in open source and engineering challenges, just go to opensource.saucelabs.com/blog. And wrapping up, as I mentioned slightly before, there are a few things that are important. We have identified that it's key to reach out to different teams and find how they can join our open source movement, let's call it like that, because this is more an organizational effort than rather just a single team. The more people get involved, the more spread the word is, the more successful the organization will be, and this is a great benefit for the community. Also, as I just mentioned in the previous slide, we need to be inclusive because like some people cannot do open source. So we have to offer alternatives. What we're offering for now is the blog, the developers blog, but we want to find other ways to involve them in this movement as well. And something that I hope that you have gotten, and it's kind of clear throughout the story we're telling you, is that when engineers, developers, and people who are part of the product team, part of the engineering team, when they are able to talk directly to the users who are understanding and giving every single day a use for the software that is delivered, this feedback cycle is much better, it is much more frequent, and the creativity is triggered through this interaction. And what ends up happening is that this constant feedback, like the excitement of seeing people using your software and making it better and bigger, it just triggering the product obsession. Like when you see that your code is actually being used and being useful, you will get the product obsession as a natural result. And with that, we would like to wrap up, and we want to truly thank you for all the time. Oh, I am just forgetting the last item. I'm sorry. I think because I was forgetting that because Christian mentioned that at the beginning, which is super important, that the approach we're taking here is what we think will work for Sauce Labs, but it could be completely different for your organization. So thank you very much. It has been great to have you during this almost hour. And if you have any questions, any comments, we're here to answer them, Christian and me. And again, thank you very much for taking the time to attend this talk.
Great, thank you so much, Diego. Thank you, Christian. Really appreciate that great presentation. And Diego, like you said, we do now have about 10 minutes or so for a Q&A session. As a reminder, you can still submit your questions through that questions pane in your attendee control panel. So if you do have any questions, comments, things you want to share, please submit them there. I'm going to give everyone a minute to build out the question list here, and I thought we'd start with a couple of questions that we received in advance of the webinar today. Starting out with these two related questions, I think. So Christian and Diego, we heard from a couple of users. Konstantinos wanted to know more about the time required for open source work. And a SAS user named Dion was asking, how do you plan to address keeping open source projects in good health? I think you touched on this briefly in the presentation around the time commitment and the work. But could you expand on the time requirement for maintaining these projects and any suggestions you have for others that are looking to balance that open source time with other commitments that they have?
Sure. Of course, this can be different in every company. The easiest way to answer or to define rules around this is by actually talking to wherever the open source program office is being under, for our case, the CTO and other people to get their expectation on how open source should be managed. And there's often, in our case, in our guidelines, we define that every team can do an open source project when they get an approval by their managers. And the manager needs to understand how important that is for the product trajectory. And depending on that, can allocate enough time to the team to actually maintain the open source project. At the end of the day, it needs to fulfill the business purposes, and for that, it justifies to have the team working to some extent, but it has to be like approved by the manager and understand by the manager what the team is doing. And to the other question, I would say there are general good open source guidelines that help you understand if a project is healthy or not. I think in general, looking at the amount of people that engage with you in that project, not only contribute back, but also creating tutorials and a lot of content around your project can give you a sense of how healthy your community and your project is. As better you have contribution guidelines, and as easier you define issues, or as better you define issues, you can help a lot of people get started with the project. And you see that in more contribution, more diversified contributions. And as Diego mentioned, the Chaos team has set some kind of like quality standards for open source projects that can help you kind of like measure that, as well as define those kind of metrics.
Right, and I think as we also mentioned across the presentation, one way to make projects healthy open source projects healthy is an example is the Selenium project. I have been a part of the project for about 3 or 4 years, and one of the common questions I was getting in meetups or conferences was like how I can be part of the project. And that's when I started to check on that, like how do other projects do it, and I got to learn about the governance model, how a project is run and executed, the structure of a project. So something we triggered in this open source program office is to propose a governance project for the Selenium project itself. So nowadays people have a clear way on how to get involved. If I want to become a committer to the Selenium project, what do I need to do? We are also recognizing things like code is important, but it's not the most important thing in the project. So people who are helping us to triage GitHub issues, they are part of the project as well. So having clear guidelines on how someone can join and what your role and what your responsibilities are as part of a project, it's a way to keep these projects healthy and make them long lasting for the future.
Great, thank you both. And I think, Diego, what you were just talking about with having those guidelines and being really committed and engaged in these projects, I think that speaks to this community that we're building and community that we're participating, right? Our participation with open source obviously goes beyond just our work at Sauce Labs. You mentioned earlier that this is certainly both internally and externally focused. And we have a question on those lines. Question that came in here from Jason asking, how are you engaging the community and contributing back? Beyond just the work of the open source program office, which I think is a big step in that direction. What does that external community engagement and contribution from us look like with open source?
I can speak from the WebDriver side. Even though there are some roadmap items for WebDriver on the open source program office, I often just after work sit down and like to engage with the community on the support channel, or I recently started an open office hour event every Wednesday, where I sit down with people who are interested in contributing to WebDriver and sit down with them for 1 hour and explain them how the project looks like and where they would need to get started if they want to tackle a specific issue. And that has been very interesting for me, because not only get I to understand and get to know the people that are interested in contributing, but also I see where the project is lacking in documentation and where we could improve to be more inclusive to people that might be not as technical as other people are. So that was really helpful for me to engage with the community outside.
Yeah, and something else we're doing, and I have been personally a very enthusiast of that type of things, is meetups and giving a place for the community to meet. So in Berlin and London and now in Barcelona, we have the continuous testing meetup that it's just a place for people to meet and exchange ideas about anything related to testing. We give the place for speakers to share their ideas, first-time speakers, experienced speakers. So it's a place for the community to just meet and share ideas. Nowadays it's virtual, but we hope to do in-person events pretty soon as things get normal, wherever we can do that. So, but in addition to that, I also like to give talks to Latin America. Like, I am from Colombia and I like to do meetups in Latin America in Spanish to spread the knowledge about Selenium and the good practice about open source. So that's a way to give back to the community, because I have been privileged to get to know really great people across my career that have led me to get into this place where I am today. So a way to give back is just like to share this type of knowledge back to your roots, to your origins, and give hints on how people can improve themselves as well.
Great, thank you. A lot of wonderful outreach happening there, and we'll be glad to share more information about those continuous testing meetups and other opportunities with everyone following this event. And unfortunately, that brings us to the top of the hour. So we won't be able to get to any more questions today. But really want to, again, say thank you to Diego and Christian for that presentation. Thank you to everyone for tuning in, for spending an hour with us today. Couple of notes before we wrap up. When you exit the webinar, you'll see a survey on the presentation. We'd really appreciate if you could provide your feedback. It's just a few questions on that brief survey. Following the event, you will also receive an email again with those links for the recording as well as the slides that Christian and Diego shared. And with that, really on behalf of Sauce Labs, on behalf of our presenters, again, thank you so much for joining us. Take care of yourselves and enjoy the rest of your day.